The air hung heavy and wet over the savannah, thick enough to taste. It wrapped around everything, a damp blanket that never quite lifted, even when the sun beat down with a vengeance. Spanish moss, grey and stringy, dripped from ancient oaks, swaying just enough to suggest something unseen was moving through the dense woods. Plantations here weren't just big houses. They were worlds unto themselves, isolated pockets of wealth and pain, swallowed by the endless green and the slow, muddy rivers. There was a quietness to this land, a deep hum that wasn't peace, but something heavier, something that felt like holding your breath. It was a place where beauty and dread lived side by side, a chilling kind of harmony. Ezekiel entered this world on one of those plantations, born already belonging to someone else. His earliest memories were of dirt floors, the smell of sweat, and the distant rhythmic creak of the cotton gin. He learned quickly that his body was not his own, that his days were marked by the sun's rise and fall, and by the constant, watchful eyes of overseers. He saw things a child shouldn't see, whips cutting through skin, faces contorted in pain, hunger gnawing at bellies. He watched his mother's eyes grow duller with each passing year, her spirit slowly worn down like an old stone. He saw men broken, their wills shattered, their voices silenced. He himself felt the sting of the lash, the ache in his muscles from sunup to sundown work. It was an existence defined by limits, by the constant reminder that he was less than human in the eyes of those who owned him. He learned to move quietly, to keep his gaze down, to make himself small. But inside, something else was stirring. Deep within Ezekiel, beneath the layers of fear and exhaustion, a quiet awareness began to form. He wasn't just a body to be worked, a tool to be used. He was a person, with thoughts and feelings that didn't disappear just because no one asked about them. He saw the injustice, stark and undeniable, in every sunrise that brought another day of toil, in every meal that barely filled his stomach, in every act of casual cruelty. He didn't cry out, he didn't rebel openly. Instead, he watched, he listened, he absorbed. It wasn't despair that took root in him, not entirely. It was a cold, steady defiance, a hidden strength that grew stronger with each indignity. It was the feeling that this couldn't be all there was, that this could not be the natural order of things. A small, hard knot of conviction began to form in his gut, a promise he made only to himself. His first master, a man named Henderson, was not outwardly monstrous in the way some were. He didn't bellow or rage often. His cruelty was quieter, more insidious. Henderson saw his enslaved people as extensions of his property, like his fields or his livestock. They were there to produce. Their suffering was merely an inconvenience if it affected production. He would walk through the rows of cotton, a slight smile playing on his lips, occasionally flicking his cane at a bent back. Not out of anger, but out of a perverse sense of ownership, a reminder of who was in charge. He spoke in low, measured tones, yet every word carried the weight of absolute power. Ezekiel watched him, a shadow among shadows. He saw the way Henderson's eyes would linger on a young woman, the dismissive wave of his hand when someone pleaded for mercy, the casualness with which he discussed selling families apart. Henderson's arrogance was a thick skin, impenetrable, built on generations of unquestioned authority. Ezekiel felt a slow, burning heat in his chest, a feeling that went beyond simple hatred. It was a recognition. This man, this entire system, was a deep, festering wound. The plantation itself was carved out of the wild, untamed land. Beyond the fields, the woods were dense, a labyrinth of cypress knees and slow-moving water. Ezekiel knew those woods better than any overseer. He knew the soft spots in the earth, the places where the ground gave way, where the roots of trees formed hidden traps. He knew how the rain turned certain areas into boggy pits, how easily a man could lose his way, how quickly the earth could reclaim what was put into it. He spent hours working the fields, his hands in the soil, feeling its texture, understanding its secrets. He saw the way the land breathed, the way it consumed. And as Henderson continued his quiet reign of terror, a dark thought, cold and clear, began to take root in Ezekiel's mind. It wasn't a sudden burst of anger, but a slow, methodical calculation. The earth, he realized, was not just for growing cotton, it was also for burying. and the earth, he knew, was patient. Henderson's cruelty, though often understated, steadily worsened. He started demanding more work, pushing everyone past their limits. The rations grew smaller, the punishments for minor infractions harsher. One sweltering afternoon, a young boy, no older than 10, collapsed in the cotton fields from exhaustion. Henderson, riding by on his horse, simply ordered the overseer to whip him until he stood again. Ezekiel watched, his hands still moving mechanically, picking cotton. He saw the boy's small body jerk with each lash, heard his faint cries. That night, the boy died. Henderson barely acknowledged it, merely grumbling about the loss of a field hand. Another time, a woman named Sarah, who had just given birth, was ordered back to the fields barely a week later. Her milk was still coming in, her body weak. She tried to explain, to beg for a few more days. Henderson just sneered, saying she was lazy and that her child could wait. When she tried to stand up for herself, he had her tied to a post and whipped in front of everyone. Her screams echoed across the plantation. Ezekiel remembered the look in her eyes, a mix of pain and utter defeat. It was a look he saw often, but this time it felt different. It solidified something within him. Henderson wasn't just cruel, he was a machine of suffering, grinding down every soul around him. The air on the plantation became heavy, thick with fear and unspoken resentment. Everyone walked on eggshells, knowing that any perceived misstep could lead to brutal consequences. The overseers, emboldened by Henderson's indifference, became more aggressive, their whips cracking with chilling regularity. The despair that had been a quiet hum was now a loud, constant thrum, pressing down on everyone. Ezekiel, however, didn't let the fear consume him. Instead, he channeled it. He began to watch Henderson with a new intensity, not just observing his cruelty, but dissecting his routine. He noticed that Henderson always took a solitary ride to the far end of the plantation, near the old, forgotten swamp, every Tuesday afternoon. He went to inspect a patch of timber he was considering clearing. This was a habit he had maintained for years, a small personal ritual that no one else seemed to notice or care about. Henderson thought himself untouchable, his movements predictable because he had no reason to fear. He would leave the main house around 2 o'clock, ride for about an hour, spend some time surveying the trees, and return just before sunset. He rarely took an overseer with him on these trips, preferring his own company and the quiet contemplation of his property. Ezekiel also noted Henderson's love for a particular type of fresh water, drawn from a small, clear spring deep in the woods not far from the swamp. Henderson insisted on having a jug of it in his study every day. He believed it had medicinal properties, a little superstition he held on to. Ezekiel knew the path to that spring too. He knew the soft, muddy ground around it, the dense undergrowth, the way the light barely touched the forest floor there. He noticed that Henderson would sometimes dismount near the spring to stretch his legs or just to enjoy the solitude. One Tuesday, a heavy rain had fallen the night before, making the ground particularly soft and treacherous, especially near the swamp. Ezekiel had been sent to clear some fallen branches near the edge of the woods, a task that placed him perfectly on Henderson's usual route. He saw Henderson ride by, his head held high, oblivious. Ezekiel finished his task and then, instead of returning to the fields, he slipped deeper into the woods, moving silently through the familiar terrain. He made his way to the area Henderson was known to frequent, near the old timber patch. The ground was indeed soft, almost like quicksand in places, especially where the spring fed into the larger swampy area. He found a spot, a particularly unstable patch of earth near a cluster of old cypress trees, where the ground gave way easily. He worked quickly, efficiently, using a broken branch to loosen the soil, to make the unstable ground even more so, disguising his efforts with fallen leaves and mud. He knew exactly where Henderson would likely dismount. He waited. The air was thick with humidity, the silence only broken by the buzzing of insects. He heard the distant hoofbeats, growing steadily louder. Henderson appeared, riding his horse, just as Ezekiel had anticipated. The master dismounted, tying his horse to a low-hanging branch, and began to walk towards the timber, his hands clasped behind his back, surveying his domain. He walked straight towards the spot Ezekiel had prepared. Ezekiel held his breath. Henderson's boot sank into the soft earth, then the other. He tried to pull his leg free, but the mud gripped him. He stumbled, falling forward, his hands sinking into the mire. He tried to push himself up, but the earth was too yielding, too hungry. He was caught. Ezekiel emerged from the shadows, a shovel he had found leaning against a tree in his hand. Henderson looked up, his eyes widening in surprise, then fear. He tried to speak, but the mud was already up to his chest, choking his words. He struggled, thrashing, but it only made him sink faster. Ezekiel didn't say a word. He began to shovel the soft earth, steadily, methodically, onto Henderson's struggling form. Each scoop of mud landed with a wet thud. Henderson's struggles became weaker, his pleas gurgles. His eyes, once so arrogant, now held pure terror, staring up at Ezekiel. Ezekiel kept shoveling, his face unmoving, his movements precise. He worked until there was no sign of Henderson, only a freshly disturbed patch of earth that would soon be indistinguishable from the rest of the swampy ground. He smoothed out the last of the soil, ensuring no trace remained. He walked away, leaving the shovel behind, disappearing back into the dense woods. The next morning, there was a commotion. Henderson was missing. His horse had returned to the stables, riderless. Overseers were sent out, shouting his name, searching the fields and the main paths. Ezekiel, back in the cotton fields, worked as usual, his face impassive. He heard the shouts, the panic, the growing confusion. He watched the search parties, knowing they would never find what they were looking for. He felt no triumph, no joy, only a chilling satisfaction. Henderson was gone, consumed by the same earth he had claimed as his own. The secret of the first grave was his, a heavy, silent weight, but also a strange, new power. He had chosen the earth as his weapon, the silent, patient earth that took everything and gave nothing back. The plantation buzzed with whispers, theories of runaway slaves, wild animals, or even divine judgment. No one, not a single soul, looked at Ezekiel. He was just another enslaved man, toiling in the fields, his hands covered in the very soil that held their master's secret. And in that secret, a dark seed of purpose began to sprout, firm and unyielding. The plantation was in chaos for weeks after Henderson's disappearance. His cousin, a man named Thomas, arrived quickly from Charleston to take over. Thomas was younger than Henderson, perhaps in his late 20s, but he carried himself with an air of inherited authority, a sneer already etched into his face. He was not outright cruel in the same blunt way Henderson had been, but his cruelty was colder, more calculating. He believed in breaking spirits, not just bodies. He introduced new, harsher rules, cut rations, and increased the workload, all while maintaining a veneer of calm superiority. He would often walk through the fields, a whip coiled neatly at his hip, observing, always observing, as if trying to catch someone in an unspoken act of defiance. Ezekiel watched him. He saw the subtle shifts in Thomas's routine, the way he preferred to be alone early in the mornings, riding out to inspect the farthest reaches of the cotton fields, believing himself unseen. He noticed Thomas's fastidious nature, his dislike for dirt, his constant need for things to be in order. The other enslaved people on the plantation felt the tightening grip of Thomas's rule. There was a new, deeper silence in the quarters at night, a heavy sense of dread. Yet, some would glance at Ezekiel, not directly, but in passing, a flicker of something unreadable in their eyes. He had done nothing, said nothing, but the air around him had changed. He was still the quiet, hard-working man, but now there was a weight to his stillness, a depth that hadn't been there before. No one spoke of Henderson, not openly, but his sudden absence hung in the air, a silent question mark that everyone avoided. Ezekiel knew they wondered, they speculated, but no one dared to connect the dots. He was a shadow moving through their fear, carrying his secret like a hidden weapon. The opportunity for Thomas came during a particularly hot and dry spell. The ground was hard, cracked, but a section near the old well, rarely used, remained perpetually damp, fed by an underground spring. Thomas, in his meticulous way, decided it needed to be drained and filled. A project he oversaw personally, often alone, directing a small crew of men, including Ezekiel, to dig a new channel. He would stand at the edge of the muddy pit, barking orders, his boots clean, his voice sharp. Ezekiel saw the perfect spot. It was a narrow, deep trench, surrounded by loose, unstable soil that had been dug up. One morning, Thomas was alone at the well, examining the progress, his back to the path. Ezekiel approached him, carrying a heavy bucket of water, feigning a stumble. The bucket crashed near Thomas's feet, splashing mud onto his pristine boots and trousers. Thomas roared, turning, his face contorted in rage. He raised his hand to strike Ezekiel, but in that moment, Ezekiel had already moved. With a swift, almost invisible motion, he pushed Thomas, not hard, but just enough for the man to lose his balance on the slick edge of the trench. Thomas tumbled in, landing awkwardly in the muddy water at the bottom, his leg twisting under him. He screamed, not in pain, but in outrage, trying to scramble out. His leg was clearly broken. Ezekiel did not wait. He began to kick at the loose earth piled beside the trench. The dry, cracked soil gave way easily, pouring down in torrents, mixing with the water, quickly turning into a thick, clinging sludge. Thomas, trapped and injured, thrashed wildly, his screams muffled by the falling earth. Ezekiel worked with grim efficiency, his face blank, until the trench was filled, the mud settling over Thomas's struggling form. When the last of the earth was in place, he smoothed it over with his foot, leaving no trace of the disturbance. Only a slightly raised mound that would soon settle. He walked away, leaving the now empty bucket by the well, his heart beating a steady, cold rhythm. Thomas was reported missing later that day. The search was more intense this time, a deeper fear gripping the white community. The plantation owners in the area started talking, whispering about the cursed land, the bad luck. But still, no one suspected Ezekiel. He was just a slave who had spilled water. The third master, a distant cousin named Arthur, arrived with a grim determination. He was a heavy-set man with a florid face and a cruel, leering smile. Arthur was a known drunkard and a gambler, and he saw the plantation as a means to pay off his debts, not a responsibility. He quickly surpassed the previous masters in his casual brutality, finding amusement in tormenting the enslaved people for the slightest infraction. He had a particular fondness for the old sugar mill, often spending late nights there, drinking and playing cards with his overseers. The mill was isolated, surrounded by dense, overgrown cane fields. Ezekiel observed Arthur's habits, his slurred speech after midnight, his unsteady gait as he left the mill, often alone, stumbling through the dark paths. He also noted the large, unused iron rollers in the mill, heavy and forgotten, partially buried in the damp earth near the back wall, close to a deep, natural depression that had once been a drainage ditch. It was the perfect spot. One moonless night, Ezekiel waited. He had spent days subtly loosening the earth around one of the massive iron rollers, using tools he had fashioned from broken farm implements. Arthur, humming a drunken tune, staggered out of the mill, his shadow long and distorted in the weak lamplight from inside. He paused, fumbling for a cigar. Ezekiel emerged from the cane field, a silent spectre. Arthur, startled, let out a yelp. Ezekiel didn't speak, he just moved, pushing the heavy roller with all his might. The earth gave way. The roller shifted, then began to move, slowly at first, then picking up speed, tumbling towards the drainage ditch. Arthur, caught off guard, tripped and fell into the ditch just as the roller reached him. There was a sickening crunch, a gurgle, and then silence. Ezekiel then quickly used a shovel to bury the roller and Arthur in the ditch, covering it with earth and cane stalks. The distinct smell of stale rum and something else, something metallic, hung heavy in the air. The disappearances were no longer accidents in the minds of the white folk. They were a pattern, a curse. Whispers of a vengeful spirit, a shadow that walked the fields, began to spread beyond the plantation, reaching neighboring estates. The air on the plantation grew thick with a palpable unease. The remaining white inhabitants and overseers moved with nervous glances, their bravado slowly eroding into fear. They spoke of bad omens, of the land being unholy, of a darkness that had settled upon them. Ezekiel, however, felt a strange kind of peace. Each burial was a stroke of justice, a reclamation of dignity. He was no longer just Ezekiel, the slave. He was the silent hand of retribution, a terrifying force that moved unseen, unheard, carrying out his grim purpose. His spirit, once broken, had hardened into something unyielding, a weapon against the very system that had sought to destroy him. He was becoming something more than a man. He was becoming the embodiment of the plantation's dark, buried secrets. The fourth master, a distant cousin named Thomas, arrived with a nervous energy that set him apart from his predecessors. He had heard the stories, the hushed tales of strange disappearances, but he dismissed them as slave superstition, a tactic to scare off new owners. Thomas was a man of logic, or so he claimed, and he believed the previous masters were simply careless. He brought with him a new overseer, a wiry man named Silas, who had a reputation for being even more ruthless than those who came before. Silas was quick to implement stricter rules, harsher punishments, and he seemed to take a perverse joy in breaking the spirits of the enslaved people. His methods were brutal, often leaving men and women bleeding and broken. Ezekiel watched Silas with a cold, steady gaze. Silas was a constant presence, always moving, always watching, rarely alone. This presented a new challenge for Ezekiel. He couldn't simply wait for Silas to stumble into a secluded spot. He needed a different approach, one that would remove both Thomas and Silas. For Silas was proving to be a greater torment than any master. The growing paranoia among the white community was palpable. The disappearances were no longer isolated incidents, but a disturbing pattern. Fear and suspicion began to spread beyond the plantation, reaching neighboring estates. Families began to openly question why so many owners of this particular plantation met such untimely ends. Attempts to investigate were made, but with no tangible evidence. No bodies, the local authorities were baffled. They blamed runaway slaves, wild animals, anything to avoid the unsettling truth that something far more sinister was at play. Silas, despite his cruelty, was not entirely oblivious. He noticed the quiet, almost unnerving calm of Ezekiel. While others flinched and cowered, Ezekiel met his gaze with an unreadable expression. This bothered Silas. He started to watch Ezekiel more closely, his eyes narrowing whenever the older man was near. He saw Ezekiel working tirelessly in the fields, his movements precise and methodical. Yet there was a stillness about him that made Silas uneasy. Silas began to carry a whip with him at all times, not just for punishment, but almost as a comfort, a symbol of his authority against the unspoken threat he felt lurking. He would often walk the perimeter of the plantation at night, his lantern swinging, casting long, dancing shadows. He felt eyes on him, but whenever he spun around there was nothing but the rustling of leaves and the chirping of crickets. One evening, Silas found Thomas in the sugar mill, unusually sober, staring out at the darkening fields. "Silas," Thomas said, his voice low, "do you truly believe these stories about ghosts?" Silas scoffed, but there was a flicker of fear in his eyes. "Superstition, Master Thomas. Nothing more. These darkies just want to scare us." Yet, as he spoke, his hand unconsciously went to the pistol holstered at his hip. That night, Ezekiel observed Silas's nightly rounds. He noticed Silas always paused near the old well, a deep, brick-lined structure that had long been disused, its wooden cover rotted and unstable. It was far from the main house, surrounded by thick brush. The next day, Ezekiel began his work. He spent hours near the well, pretending to clear brush, but subtly weakening the remaining planks of the well cover. He used an old, rusty pickaxe, making the damage look like natural decay. He knew Silas would inspect it during his rounds. That night, the air was heavy, a storm brewing. Thomas, driven by his growing unease, decided to accompany Silas on his perimeter check. They walked together, Thomas holding a lantern high, Silas clutching his pistol. As they approached the well, Silas, ever vigilant, stepped forward to examine the old cover. He put his weight on it, testing it. The rotted wood gave way with a splintering crack. Silas let out a startled cry as he plunged into the darkness below. Thomas, momentarily frozen in horror, stumbled forward, peering into the well. As he leaned over, his footing uncertain on the damp ground, Ezekiel emerged from the shadows. He didn't say a word. With a powerful shove, he sent Thomas tumbling into the well after Silas. The splash was followed by 2 muffled thuds. Ezekiel then quickly rolled a large, heavy stone, previously hidden, over the gaping hole, sealing their fate. He then scattered loose earth and leaves over the stone, making it seem like a natural part of the overgrown landscape. The wind picked up, a distant rumble of thunder. The disappearances were no longer just whispers. They were a chilling reality that paralyzed the white community. The local newspaper, usually filled with society gossip, now carried cautious articles about the cursed plantation, hinting at something unnatural. People avoided the road leading to the estate, crossing themselves when they passed the entrance. The tale of the ghost of the Savannah, a vengeful spirit that preyed on the masters of the cursed land, began to take root. It wasn't just a rumor anymore. It was a local legend, a terrifying bedtime story told to disobedient children. For the enslaved people, the fear was different. It was a fear mixed with a strange, unspoken awe. They saw the terror in the eyes of their oppressors, and a quiet sense of hope, however dangerous, began to stir within them. Ezekiel's actions, though unknown to them, had unknowingly enhanced his mystique, transforming him into a silent, terrifying force, a phantom of justice that walked the dark fields. He was becoming the embodiment of the plantation's dark, buried secrets, a living legend. The escalating disappearances on the plantation had finally drawn attention from beyond the local community. The governor, tired of the unsettling rumors and the growing fear that was affecting the region's economy, sent for a man named Arthur Finch. Finch was not a local. He was a seasoned investigator from Charleston, known for his sharp mind and his ability to see through local superstitions. He arrived in Savannah with a quiet determination, his eyes taking in everything without judgment. He didn't believe in ghosts or curses. He believed in facts and patterns. Finch's arrival was met with a mix of relief and suspicion. The local sheriff, a portly man named Deputy Miller, saw Finch as an outsider, meddling in local affairs. But the dwindling white residents of the area, desperate for answers, clung to the hope Finch represented. Finch spent his first few days simply observing. He walked the perimeter of the plantation, studied the layout of the fields, and interviewed the few remaining overseers, who were jumpy and quick to blame the curse. He noted the fear in their voices, the way they avoided eye contact when discussing the vanished masters. It wasn't long before Finch's gaze settled on Ezekiel. The man was a shadow, moving through his tasks with an almost unsettling calm. While others jumped at every creak of the old house or rustle in the bushes, Ezekiel remained placid. He worked the fields, tended the livestock, and never seemed to react to the terror that gripped the plantation. This lack of visible fear, this quiet efficiency, struck Finch as odd. He'd seen fear in the eyes of every other enslaved person he'd encountered, a constant, low hum of anxiety. But Ezekiel's eyes held a different kind of depth, a stillness that Finch couldn't quite place. Finch began to watch Ezekiel more closely. He noticed the way Ezekiel seemed to know every inch of the land, how he moved through the dense Spanish moss, as if it were an extension of himself. He'd see Ezekiel pause, sometimes, looking out at the distant tree line, a flicker of something unreadable in his expression. Finch started to follow him, discreetly at first, then more openly. He'd observe Ezekiel working, asking him simple questions about the crops or the weather, trying to gauge his reactions. Ezekiel always answered respectfully, his voice low and even, never meeting Finch's gaze for too long. The tension on the plantation was a thick, suffocating blanket. The sixth master, a man named Bartholomew, had arrived only a week before Finch. Bartholomew was a loud, boisterous man, dismissive of the superstitions that had plagued his predecessors. He laughed off the warnings, claiming he would bring order back to the plantation. He was a man of routine, always taking a solitary ride through his newly acquired land each evening, just before sunset. Finch knew this, and he suspected Ezekiel knew it too. The investigator had tried to warn Bartholomew, gently suggesting he not ride alone, but Bartholomew had scoffed. "You Charleston folk are soft," he'd declared. "I'll show these darkies who's master." Finch had merely nodded, his gaze distant. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Bartholomew rode out. Finch positioned himself on a small rise, telescope in hand, watching. He saw Bartholomew dismount near a thick copse of trees, a place Ezekiel had been working that very morning. He saw Bartholomew disappear into the shadows, and then he saw nothing. No horse returning, no sound, just the deepening twilight. Finch didn't move for another hour, his eyes straining in the dim light. He knew. He felt it in his gut, a cold certainty. The sixth master was gone. The investigator now understood he was in a game, a deadly game of cat and mouse. He had been watching, but Ezekiel had been playing. Finch returned to his small room in the main house, his mind racing. He started setting traps, subtle ones at first. He'd leave a tool out of place or a gate ajar, just to see if Ezekiel would react, if he'd show any sign of awareness. Ezekiel never did. He'd calmly put the tool back, or close the gate, without a word. It was as if he knew he was being tested, and he was simply refusing to play along. Finch began to spend his nights walking the plantation, listening, watching. He knew Ezekiel was aware of his presence. He could feel it in the air, a silent challenge. Finch would find small things, a freshly disturbed patch of earth near an old oak, a faint scent of turned soil carried on the breeze. He'd dig, sometimes for hours, finding nothing but roots and rocks. He was looking for graves, he knew, but Ezekiel was too clever. The earth held its secrets tight. The pressure of the investigation weighed heavily on Ezekiel. He felt Finch's eyes on him, a constant, unnerving presence. There were moments, brief and fleeting, when a tremor of doubt would run through him. Had he gone too far? Was this the time he would finally be caught? But then he would remember the faces of the masters, the whip marks on his own back, the cries of his people. The doubt would vanish, replaced by the cold, unwavering purpose that had driven him from the beginning. The risk of exposure was greater than ever, but so was his resolve. He had come too far to stop now. He knew Finch was smart, perhaps the smartest man to ever set foot on this cursed land. But Ezekiel also knew the land better than anyone. He was a part of it, and it was a part of him. He would not break, he would not yield, and he would not be caught. Not yet. The investigator, Finch, even felt the cold certainty of his suspicions growing stronger with each passing day. He had watched 6 masters vanish, each disappearance more unsettling than the last. The pattern was undeniable, a macabre rhythm of power and vanishing. He started to piece together the small, seemingly insignificant details he'd gathered, the way Ezekiel always seemed to be working near where a master was last seen, his quiet efficiency, the complete lack of panic or even surprise in his eyes when another master was reported missing. Finch knew, deep down, that Ezekiel was the key, the silent conductor of this grim symphony, yet proving it was like trying to catch smoke. Finch had spent countless hours digging, sifting through the earth, searching for any disturbance, any telltale sign. He'd found nothing concrete. Ezekiel was a ghost, a shadow in plain sight. But Finch was a man of logic, and logic dictated that 6 disappearances on one plantation, all under similar circumstances, pointed to a deliberate, methodical hand. He began to understand the motive, not just the how, but the why. The brutal history of the plantation, the endless cycle of cruelty, it all started to make a horrifying sense. The net was tightening, not around Ezekiel in a physical sense, but around the truth. Finch felt it pressing in on him, a heavy weight of dread and revelation. Then came the 7th master. His name was Josiah Blackwood. He arrived with a flourish, a man of immense wealth and even greater arrogance, completely oblivious, or perhaps willfully ignorant, of the dark history clinging to the plantation like Spanish moss. He'd heard the rumors, of course, but dismissed them as the ramblings of superstitious field hands and lazy overseers. "Nonsense!" he'd boomed, his voice echoing through the main house on his first day. This plantation needs a firm hand, not ghost stories. He was a man who believed money could buy anything, even control over the supernatural. Josiah was particularly fond of his morning constitutional, a long, solitary walk through the furthest reaches of the cotton fields, a habit he announced proudly to anyone who would listen. He saw it as a demonstration of his fearlessness, his absolute dominion over his new property. It was his way of showing he was different, stronger than the masters before him. Ezekiel watched him. He watched Josiah's grand pronouncements, his dismissive waves of the hand at any mention of the past. He saw the way Josiah treated the field hands, with an even colder, more detached cruelty than some of the previous masters. Josiah had a habit of leaving his silver-handled cane propped against a specific old oak tree during his walks, a small, arrogant symbol of his presence. Ezekiel noted this. He noted the exact path Josiah took, the times he left and returned, the way he paused at a certain point near the old, overgrown well, gazing out at the fields he now owned. This seventh master presented a final, stark challenge. Finch was watching, he knew. The stakes were impossibly high. This plan had to be flawless, designed not just to bury a master, but to bury the very possibility of accusation. Ezekiel spent days, not just observing Josiah, but observing Finch. He was aware of every subtle shift in Finch's routine, every new vantage point the investigator took. He knew Finch was looking for him, waiting for him to make a mistake. So, Ezekiel decided to use that vigilance to his advantage. He began digging, not where he intended to bury Josiah, but in a completely different, obvious spot. He would work there for hours, making sure Finch saw him, making sure Finch found the freshly turned earth. He knew Finch would dig and find nothing. It would be another dead end, another frustration for the investigator. This was part of the elaborate misdirection. The actual plan for Josiah was meticulously crafted, relying on the master's own arrogance and habits. On the chosen morning, a day with a heavy, oppressive humidity that made the air thick and still, Ezekiel made sure the old well was open. He had loosened some of the stones around its rim days before, subtly, so it looked like natural decay. He knew Josiah liked to pause there, to survey his domain. Ezekiel had also, over time, been slowly deepening the ground around the well, creating a slight, almost imperceptible slope towards it, covered by tall grass. He had even managed to rig a loose, unstable plank across a section of the well opening, a plank that looked sturdy enough but would give way under a man's weight. Josiah Blackwood, true to his routine, set off on his morning walk. He left his silver-handled cane against the old oak. Finch, from his hidden vantage point, watched Josiah go. He also watched Ezekiel, who was, as expected, diligently digging at the false gravesite. Finch sighed, frustrated, and turned his attention back to Josiah. He saw Josiah pause at the well, just as Ezekiel had predicted. He saw Josiah lean forward, perhaps to get a better view of the fields, or to peer into the depths of the old well, a casual gesture of ownership. And then, the ground beneath Josiah gave way, the loose plank snapped. There was a brief, startled cry, quickly muffled. The old well swallowed the seventh master whole. Finch watched, frozen. He saw it happen, yet he couldn't grasp it. It was too quick, too sudden, too perfectly aligned with Josiah's own habits. He saw no one near the well. He saw Ezekiel still digging at his distant, false grave. The investigator scrambled down the rise, running towards the well, his mind racing, trying to make sense of the accident. He looked into the dark, silent hole. Nothing, just the faint echo of water and the unsettling quiet. He looked around frantically, searching for any sign of foul play, any disturbance. He found the silver-handled cane still propped against the old oak, exactly where Josiah had left it. It was a perfect, horrifying accident. Finch returned to the main house, his heart pounding. He reported the incident, the tragic accident of the seventh master falling into the old well. He watched as the other overseers, the few remaining white residents, rushed to the scene. He knew, with a chilling certainty that twisted his gut, that it wasn't an accident. He knew. He looked across the fields, towards where Ezekiel was now calmly walking away from his false digging site, a silent, almost imperceptible nod in his posture. Finch understood. He understood the motive, the method, the cold, calculated genius of it all. He had been watching, but Ezekiel had been playing a much longer, much deeper game. The investigator now knew the truth. the horrifying secret of the Savannah plantation, a secret buried deep, just like its masters. He knew, but he couldn't prove it, not in a way that would ever convince anyone else. The horror wasn't just the disappearances, but the understanding that a man, enslaved and brutalized, had found a way to exact such a precise, terrifying vengeance, right under the noses of those who believed they held all the power. Ezekiel had been unmasked, not by direct confrontation, but by the chilling clarity of Finch's own realization. He saw all of it, the quiet strength, the hidden resolve, the silent victory in Ezekiel's eyes. The story of the ghosts was far more terrifying than anyone had imagined. Finch felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He had seen the truth, a truth so dark and unbelievable it would sound like madness to anyone else. He had watched Josiah Blackwood fall, and he had seen Ezekiel walk away, his back straight, his movements calm. There was no joy, no fear, just a quiet finality. Finch knew. He had to report it, not as an accident, but as a murder. But how? How could he explain what he knew without sounding insane? He had no proof, only a gut feeling born from weeks of observation and a sudden, terrible clarity. He walked into the modest, dusty office of the local sheriff, a man named Deputy Miller, whose main concerns usually involved stray livestock or drunken brawls. Miller looked up, startled by Finch's pale face and wild eyes. Finch began to speak, his voice raspy, telling the story not of a fall, but of a pattern. He recounted the disappearances, the vague theories, the growing fear. Then he spoke of Ezekiel, his quiet intelligence, his constant presence, his unnatural calm. He laid out his theory, how Ezekiel, with an intimate knowledge of the land and the master's habits, had orchestrated each accident. He described the loose plank, the carefully placed cane, the way Ezekiel had led him to understand. Deputy Miller listened, his expression moving from skepticism to disbelief, then to a growing, horrified understanding. He interrupted Finch several times, asking for details, for proof, for anything concrete. Finch could only offer his observations, his deductions, the chilling logic of it all. He admitted he had no physical evidence, no eyewitness to a direct act of violence, but he had the pattern, the 7 masters, each disappearing under seemingly accidental circumstances, each one buried by the land itself. Miller, a man of simple facts, found himself wrestling with a horror that transcended his usual understanding of crime. The idea of an enslaved man, a man considered property, plotting and executing such a series of meticulous murders, was beyond his comprehension, yet the investigator's conviction was undeniable. The report, when it finally reached the higher authorities in Savannah, was met with a mixture of outrage and outright disbelief. A slave? Impossible. Yet the persistent disappearances, the abandoned plantation, the sheer number of lost masters, could no longer be dismissed as mere bad luck. The truth, however unpalatable, had to be confronted. A massive manhunt was launched, turning the usually peaceful Savannah landscape into a tense, desperate hunting ground. Posses were formed, bloodhounds were brought in, and every enslaved person on neighboring plantations was questioned, their fear palpable. The white community, already unnerved by the curse of the plantation, was now gripped by a new, more terrifying fear, the fear of a vengeful, intelligent, enslaved man. The thought that one of their own, a person they considered beneath them, could outsmart and eliminate 7 of their kind, was an unbearable affront to their perceived superiority. Ezekiel, however, seemed to vanish into thin air. He knew the land like no other. He had spent his entire life working it, navigating its hidden paths, understanding its rhythms. The dense Spanish moss became his camouflage, the thick undergrowth his shield. He moved with a quiet efficiency that baffled his pursuers. He left no tracks where a man would expect them, instead using streams, rocky outcrops, and stretches of hard, dry ground. He seemed to anticipate their movements, always staying one step ahead, a ghost in his own homeland. The urgency of the search grew with each passing day, fueled by fear and humiliation. The idea of Ezekiel still out there, a free man, a killer, was a poison in their minds. Before his final escape, Ezekiel performed one last, quiet act of defiance. He returned to the abandoned plantation, not to the main house, but to the small, neglected slave quarters. There, among the dilapidated shacks and forgotten tools, he carefully carved a single, simple mark into the doorframe of his old cabin. It was a symbol he had seen once, long ago, in a book owned by one of the masters. A small, almost imperceptible drawing of a bird taking flight. It was a silent message, a declaration of his freedom, a final gesture to the life he was leaving behind. He did not seek to be found, or to boast. It was simply for himself, a quiet acknowledgement of his journey, a mark of his agency. Then, he turned and melted back into the shadows of the swamp, leaving the plantation behind forever. The plantation itself, once a symbol of wealth and power, became a place of dread. No one dared to live there. The fields lay fallow, the grand house slowly decaying, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the overgrown land. The well, where Josiah Blackwood had met his end, was eventually filled in, a desperate attempt to bury the memory of what had happened, but the fear remained. It became a site of morbid fascination, a place whispered about in hushed tones, a testament to the horrors that had transpired there. People avoided it, claiming to hear strange noises, to feel an unsettling presence. The land, they said, remembered. Ezekiel's journey took him south, further into the wild, untamed territories. His future was uncertain, his path unknown. He carried the weight of his actions, not as a burden, but as a grim satisfaction. He had sought justice, a brutal, unforgiving justice, born from unimaginable suffering. He had buried his masters, not just in the earth, but in their own fear, in the very fabric of their society. He was no longer a slave, but a man who had forged his own freedom, leaving behind a legacy of terror and a haunting mystery that would echo through the generations. He was a whisper in the wind, a shadow in the swamp, a legend in the making. His personal outcome, whether he found peace or continued his path of retribution, remained ambiguous, but his impact was undeniable. The story of Ezekiel, the silent avenger, became a legend, whispered from one generation to the next, weaving itself into the very fabric of the Savannah. For the white communities, it was a terrifying cautionary tale, a dark warning against the raw, untamed power of retribution. It spoke of a slave who had broken free from all chains, not just physical ones, but the mental shackles of subservience and fear. His name was spoken in hushed tones, a boogeyman invoked to keep order, a chilling reminder that even the lowest could rise with terrifying purpose. They told tales of how he moved like a phantom, how he knew the land better than any tracker, how he had twisted the very earth to do his bidding. The fear he instilled was not just about the loss of life, but the shattering of their absolute control, the idea that their property could turn against them with such cold, methodical intent. But for the enslaved people and later, their descendants, Ezekiel's story took on a different meaning. It became a powerful symbol of resistance, a defiant roar against an unjust system. His name was a secret code, a spark of hope in the darkest of times. It wasn't a story of senseless violence, but of a man pushed beyond human endurance, who found a way to reclaim his dignity, even if it meant embracing a terrifying path. They saw him not as a monster, but as an avenger, a dark angel who brought justice where there was only cruelty. The legend evolved, blurring the lines between fact and folklore, growing richer with each retelling. Some said he could disappear into the shadows at will, others that he commanded the spirits of the swamp. He was a force of nature, an embodiment of the land's own silent protest against the injustices inflicted upon it. The old plantation, the setting of Ezekiel's grim work, never recovered. It remained a place of mystery and dread, forever tainted by the events that had unfolded there. The grand house, once filled with the laughter and tyranny of its masters, slowly crumbled, consumed by the relentless march of time and nature. Vines crept up its walls, Spanish moss draped heavier from its ancient oaks, and the Savannah heat baked its decaying timbers. Local accounts spoke of strange occurrences, disembodied whispers carried on the wind, flickering lights in the abandoned manor. and the unsettling feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. People claimed to hear the faint echoes of struggles, the muffled cries of men buried alive, carried up from the very earth. The land itself, they said, became a keeper of dark secrets, a silent witness to the horrors and the grim retribution. It was a place where the veil between worlds felt thin, where the past was not truly past. The impact of Ezekiel's actions resonated far beyond the boundaries of that single plantation. It subtly altered the perception of power and control throughout the region. While the system of slavery persisted for decades, the absolute certainty of the enslavers was shaken. A new, unspoken fear took root, the fear of the oppressed turning, of the silent enduring becoming the terrifying avenger. Masters became a little more wary, overseers a little more cautious, always with the ghost of Ezekiel lurking in the back of their minds. The fear of the buried lingered, a constant, low thrum beneath the surface of their seemingly ordered world. It was a fear that seeped into their dreams, a chilling reminder that their dominance was not absolute, that even the earth itself could turn against them. Ezekiel's ultimate fate remained an enigma, a crucial element that fueled the enduring mystery of his legend. Did he find true freedom in the untouched wilderness he sought? Did he continue his path of retribution elsewhere, a silent harbinger of justice in a world steeped in injustice? Or did he simply melt away, becoming one with the swamps and forests he knew so intimately, his body returning to the earth that had been his confidant and his weapon? No one ever knew for sure. His personal outcome was less important than the power of his actions, their lasting impact etched into history. He had challenged the very foundations of power, not with open rebellion, but with a chilling, methodical precision that was arguably far more terrifying. The story of Ezekiel, the Savannah slave who buried 7 masters alive, stands as a chilling reflection on the nature of justice in an inherently unjust world. It forces us to confront the terrifying implications of desperate acts born from unimaginable suffering. It is a tale that speaks to the darkest corners of human experience, where the oppressed, stripped of all humanity, transforms into a terrifying force seeking a brutal, undeniable reckoning. His story is not one of simple good versus evil, but a complex, disturbing narrative of survival, vengeance, and the enduring horror of a system that could push a man to such extremes. Ezekiel remains a haunting figure, forever etched into the dark, shadowed history of the Savannah, a testament to the fact that even the earth can hold secrets, and that sometimes the ground itself demands justice. His legend persists, a whisper in the wind, a shadow in the swamp, a chilling echo of a past that refuses to be truly buried.